All right. Hello. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you so much for being here at Housing Works this evening. I'm Genevieve Wagner. I'm on the public programs team at the Municipal Art Society of New York, also known as MAS, and we're helping coordinate this book talk, and we've been working with Housing Works for almost a year. Our collaboration anniversary is in August. To do these monthly book talks about New York City books, new and noteworthy New York City books, and a little bit more about MAS. We've been around for 130 years, and we lift up the voices of people in the debates that shape New York's built environment, and we lead the way toward a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline through our work in all 5 boroughs. And yeah, with these book talk programs, we always invite different researchers, writers, and creatives to join us on this little stage and discuss their love for New York City life, history, culture, and more. And tonight we have 2 such talents with us to celebrate a new addition to the New York City nonfiction canon. Life Underground explores the society below the surface and the varieties of experiences among unhoused people in New York City, bringing together anecdotal material, field observations, photographs, transcribed conversations with residents, and excerpts from personal journals. Terry Williams, our writer right here, provides a vivid ethnographic portrait of individual people, day-to-day activities, and the social world of the underground and their engagement with the world above. Now I'm going to share some details about our speakers. So the writer of tonight's book, Terry Williams, is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the New School for Social Research, and he has written many books about New York and has become a biographer of New York City's hidden social worlds. His previous books are Growing Up Poor, The Cocaine Kids, The Crack House, and most recently, before Life Underground, The Con Men Hustling in New York City, Teenage Suicide Notes and Ethnography of Self-Harm, The Boogie Woogie Inside an After Hours Club, The Soft City, Sex for Business and Pleasure in New York City, and then Life Underground. And we have a bunch of his books over here, and you can take a look at those after the program. And then our moderator for tonight is Hakim Hasan, who is the former director of public programs at the Museum of the City of New York. He also co-founded the Urban Dialogue Seminar Series at Metropolitan College of New York. And Mr. Hasan just completed a collection of poems titled Speak for Myself. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to kick off this conversation.
Good evening, and thank you, Genevieve Wagner, and everyone at the Municipal Art Society, in conjunction with Housing Works, who work very assiduously. And I might add, on a day like today, when it's 95 degrees out, no pun intended, above ground, below ground, got off the subway on Prince Street there, and I was just praying I could get upstairs because it's like 100 degrees downstairs. So I want to thank all of you who came in this heat to hear my dear friend and colleague, Terry Williams, talk about his book, Life Underground. Just briefly, let me say that I've known Professor Williams for about 20 years. He is, in my view, one of New York's great ethnographers and sociologists, insofar as his breadth and scope of the things that he writes about. In this particular book, Life Underground, he talks about a cohort of people living under a 20-block stretch on the Upper West Side underneath the ground. One of the things that I found very interesting about this is this whole, like when I was sitting down last night thinking about this, one of the things that came to my mind is how you relate what he's writing about over the course of 20 years to the issues of homelessness, encampments, and things of this nature that all of us, both in New York and around the country, are currently dealing with. So I'm hoping during our discussion that he and I can tease out some of these issues. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Williams. He's going to read an excerpt from Life on the Ground. Then he and I will have a conversation, and afterwards we will invite questions from all of you in the audience. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Hakim, and I appreciate you having the opportunity to talk to you today. I realize it's very hot outside, and much appreciated that you're able to come here and listen to this talk today. I'll read a page or so from this manuscript, and then we'll go from there. Field note, First Descent, April 1991. I began around noon, making my way down into the many levels of Grand Central Terminal. I put on an orange train reflector vest that the engineers and workers wear, given to me by Sergeant Henry, and started walking toward the tracks. It's clear why you need to wear these vests. There are many trains moving in every direction. I crossed 21 third rail electrified tracks during the 2-hour tour, and many times felt totally bewildered by the sheer complexity of the maze-like structures. I encountered the loop of circular tracks where trains can turn without having to back up. I moved down from the second level about 25 feet above the tracks. There was an extended bridge-like structure, a grate of some sort, just hanging there with newspapers, magazines, and cardboards covering it. The sergeant called it a nest. The nest, N-E-S-T, the nest can be dated by looking at the newspapers and magazines that line them. Most are only several days old. Some are built in colonies where clusters of people live together in groups of 20 to 50 men and women, but no children. Plastic-filled garbage bags act as pillars. One nest I see spread out under one of the steel pillars that supports the Waldorf Astoria is made up with almost military precision. The ends are tucked in, and the blankets are smooth. At the head of the bed is a small metal chest that holds toiletries. 10 feet away from the spot is a private elevator made by the United States Secret Service for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Apparently, he was brought from Hyde Park in a private train car, then wheeled into the elevator and up to the Elegant Hotel. By the time I find the next underground location, I'm 30 blocks up the West Side Highway. In the area below Riverside Park, though there are several gates along the way, all are closed. Jumping over a 4-foot brick wall, I walk down a sloping, dirt-covered incline with evergreen shrubbery on both sides, next to a winding S-curve in the West Side Highway. I squeeze through a short fence before passing through a hole in an oval latticed iron gate in Riverside Park, and from there into an almost infinite black expanse. This gate is nearly invisible until you reach the bottom of the hill, but there, a platform structure extends to a stairway with a pipe-fitted banister. Only the first few rickety steps are visible. Beyond that is darkness. There are points of sheer darkness where I can't see my hands in front of me. a momentary derangement of the senses, so far removed from what I felt 5 minutes ago as I walked through sunny Riverside Park. The underground evokes unusual mental images and visual associations with a primal past. Namibian underwater lakes, hidden for thousands of years, or French caves, dark, cold places with humid air and prehistoric, mysterious jarring. In the walking in parts that are entirely dark, I fear becoming entrapped. The place, like other man-made structures, recalls catacombs, tombs, vaults, dungeons, places of confinement and enslavement. In my mind, the underground also recalls death and rebirth. Tolstoy noted such structures as places where the dead returns to life on earth. These experiences led to my idea that the underground is the unconscious mind of the city.
Again, so the excerpt that you read kind of evokes a physicality as an ethnographer and sociologist. So first, could you explain to us exactly what an ethnographer does and how you came to write this book?
Well, ethnography is basically trying to understand the world as other people see it. And I try and connect with as many people as possible to tell their own stories. And so as an ethnographer, I'm looking at the world through their eyes, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did you pick this particular site? It's underground on the Upper West Side, the West Side Highway. How did you decide that you were going to write about the various people that are underground? And you note in the book that these are folks who are largely invisible to many of us in the city. And you use the word disposal. Could you tell me how did you get into this, what you might call a research site? How did you get in there?
Well, I've been writing about New York for quite some time. And often I will have connections to people and their worlds just by accident or by chance. And this is one example of it. I happened to be standing in what the underground folk called a bank. They call themselves bankers. They were actually homeless people who would stop and ask people as they left the ATMs for money. And I followed one man who was there, and he indicated that he was going underground. And I asked him about that, and he told me it was in Riverside Park. And that was one of the ways that I started to go there. But my initial entry into the underground was in Grand Central Terminal, because my students and I were interested in talking to people who were living in the stairwells and other locations in Grand Central Terminal. And I started to follow them to find out where they went. So one morning, it must have been like 1 o'clock in the morning, I followed a group who left the information booth and started walking under Grand Central Terminal. And it turned out that there are 5 levels underneath the floor of Grand Central. And so I went as far as I could. But when I saw the electrified tracks, I decided to ask the sergeant there, his name was Sergeant Henry, if he could show me one day how I could go further. And so that was my entree, you might say, into the underground.
Right, you mentioned electrified tracks.
Yeah.
And it evoked a certain laughter from some of the people in the audience, and I'm actually laughing myself. But I think that when people read about what ethnographers and anthropologists do, they don't kind of wrap their brain around it. There's a certain danger element to this. Like, I'm sitting here thinking, did you leave a number to somebody? Like, I went down here, in these tracks, and this is where you start looking for me in the event that you might not come up from underground. But not to be like facetious, could you talk about some of the personalities and some of the people that you wrote about that stand out in this book? And can you talk about some of those people?
Well, I should mention that this was a 20-year odyssey, if you will, because once I went underground and started to meet people, I maintained a relationship with them. And so I started to ask if they would be willing to tell me their life stories. So I met a man who was named Bernard Monte Isaac, and he considered himself the Lord of the Tunnel. And I thought this would be a great person to spend some time with. And so it was a 20-year period that I followed him, interviewed him. I took him, I taught at Princeton for a minute, and I invited him to come to talk to the students in Princeton. But I followed him basically until he died. So one of the approaches that I take in doing this kind of work is not to have a short-term relationship with people, but as long a relationship as possible. And so almost everyone that I've interviewed in this particular book, I followed for many, many, many years. And so I continue to have a relationship with them. And but because he was called the Lord of the Tunnel, he also had connections with other people underground. So over that period of time, over 100 people that I actually interviewed and talked to and interacted with, and it was only 8 people that I followed during that 20 period who were actually still around after 20-year period. So, yeah, I hope I answered that.
Yes, you did. The other thing, and there's a photograph of Bernard in the book when they were at Princeton when he was teaching his class. But one of the things that I wanted to find out from you is, in your research and in your writing, would you characterize the people that you wrote about, observed over a 20-year period, as quote-unquote homeless in the classical sense of the word, whatever classical means?
Do I consider them homeless?
Homeless, yes.
Well, I ask people these questions. Do you consider yourself homeless when you're living in this space? Rats everywhere. Not having food, water. Do you consider yourself homeless? And most of them said no. They didn't consider themselves homeless. They considered themselves people who were living for a time in this particular space. They considered temporary,
Right.
but they didn't consider themselves homeless.
Right.
And then the outside world considered them disposable. So again, these definitions were not played out by individuals that I spent all this time with.
When you say the outside world considered them disposable, who are you characterizing as the outside world? Do you mean just general citizens, public policy people, or just people who are being judgmental? And the reason why what you're saying is very important is because it has great contemplative resonance for the time that we're living in, because this country in New York and around the nation is grappling with this very issue. So that's why I wanted to know the relativity of your research to the current moment.
Sure.
So the disposable part of it, could you talk a bit about that?
Remember, the population of folk that I spent all this time with, they considered to go above ground topside. And when they would go topside, they considered the people who they saw leaving, going and spending time there as disposable. and so that's basically where that reference comes from.
So,
Just from people, everyday folk.
right,
Yeah.
right. But one of the other points that you make in the book is the description of people living below ground, coming up above ground to find sustenance. They're selling books, they're doing other things to raise money, to get things that they need to bring it back below ground. Is there a relativity between the people that you study living below ground and say now people living in encampments in New York and other places in the country? Do you see any correlation based on your research between the two?
Well, when people talk about ethnography, they talk about the science of cultural description. And I didn't want to sort of get into all that. But the point is that people move from below ground to above ground because the world does not exist only underground for them. They come up topside because they connect with soup kitchens. They connect oftentimes with friends. They connect with sponsors, as it were. They do have a relationship to above ground life, as it were. So that was probably why I mentioned that.
Yeah, right. Because my sense was or is that one way of kind of thinking about homelessness is not just through the prism of quote unquote housing. That there's another element that's inferred in your book that people kind of decide, look, I want to live off the grid, but they're not totally off the grid because they have to figure out what their relationship to the city or the society that they're in and what is that. So were there any like psychological or, if you will, socio-psychiatric issues that you noticed or that they talked to you about?
Well, I mean, there are several populations underground which we have to pay attention to. First, I looked at this in terms of an ecological frame, looked at the locations of various folk underground. So at the beginning, at the mouth of the tunnel, for example, the mouth underground, there were a lot of people who were I just meant deinstitutionalized. So people who had been in mental institutions and now were released, they sort of collected themselves at the mouth of the tunnel, at the mouth of the underground. And then you go a little bit further, and there were groups of folk who sort of established lean-tos. That's to say, they had built structures themselves. And then a little further in, I found people who had been living there for 10 or 12 years, who had these embankments where they could actually live in these spaces, provide, beds. Some of them had television sets, but they were connected to the wire that was there, connected there, and then there were other people who lived a little further away. Kovacs, for example, I wrote about. He had a bunker and he had a nice apartment inside that location. So all of these spaces were sort of designated by folk who were living in these spaces, and one way or another, finding a way to call it home.
Was there a social hierarchy underground based on or the time people lived there, and were there certain gender dynamics as well that you noticed?
Well, first of all, there were very few women. I interviewed followed two women for a very long time underground. I guess you could call it a kind of group who were considered to be the top, living on the top underground. That would be, for example, Bernard. Bernard considered himself the Lord of the Tunnel because he was a person who collected books. And he's a bibliophile, so he would collect books. He was also very well read. He would also sell these books to supers along Riverside Drive. Then you had, of course, at the low end were people who were considered to be mentally challenged. That was at the lowest end underground. And then you had people who were simply beggars, if you will. You also had people who were doing con artistry, who were hanging out, doing con games. For a while, you had people who were considered the squeegee people. They would live underground, but they would go up and they would do clean people's car windows. So you had different folk living in different categories, considered different categories living underground.
How did the research subjects or informants that you wrote about, which were quite a few, how did they perceive you? Did you at any time, can you describe any of the difficulties you had during this research? Because you're from the top world.
Well, I didn't dress like this, but I would consider myself just like a worker. They knew that I was writing about their lives, and so I was accepted in that regard. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to answer that question, but I think most people just saw me as a writer, you know, as a person interested in their world, and I was accepted because of that.
How long did it take how long was the process between the time you initially went down below ground? You described that very succinctly in thick description before you were able to gain trust among the people who were there. Did that take a long time?
But trust is a difficult thing. I mean, particularly when you're going into this kind of space. Because I would go down sometime at 5 o'clock in the morning because I wanted to connect with people who were going topside. I wanted to find out what kind of life they had, what kind of work they were doing. Because a lot of them, of course, we consider them homeless, but we don't think that they are actually workers. But in fact, they were all workers of some sort. They were doing some kind of work, including selling cans and that sort of thing, and books, obviously. But I was interested in that part of their story.
Right.
And so they were accepting me on all those levels. And if you talk about over a 20-year period, and you're going down into a space like this, sometimes there was nobody there. I mean, I would come down and I would walk miles, basically, what seemed like miles, and not run into anybody.
Is this during the winter or the summer?
This is during the whole time that I was there. Sometime in the winter, I wouldn't find people. Sometime in the spring, I wouldn't find people. I mean, it just depended on almost like an accident that I would run into people underground.
Do you think some of the people that you were writing about just decided to leave and go to other places where they could exist above ground or other places?
Yeah, I mean, people were interested in, for example, in finding ways to eat. Aside from the fire pit underground, which they actually had food that they cooked. Aside from that, they wanted to go above ground to some of the best places to eat, the cheapest places to eat. And they would find soup kitchens throughout the city, some of the best soup kitchens. Sometimes that was at churches. Sometimes that was connected to missions of one sort or another. Grand Central neighborhood, for example, had a soup kitchen, and the church on 116th Street, there was another location where they would find places to eat. So they would go above ground to all of these locations to try and connect with with life, I guess you might say, topside.
What are some of, in the time that we have left, could you tell us a few of the major takeaways or findings from your 20-year research, Life on the Ground?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I like most about what was done is that I did have an opportunity to talk to people who said they had big dreams when they lived underground. There was something about living in that space. You are devoid of light for the most part. You're devoid of water, food, and really a decent shelter. So I was fascinated by to find out more about that and more about the lives that they were living at that point. And I guess the one takeaway that comes to mind is the need to look at people who have mental problems and to spend some time examining that population. So I just thought that would be one of the things that I would want to spend more time doing research on.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we're going to open it to all of you for your questions or brief comments. When you finished the book and it was finally published, how did you feel? Like when you thought about the 20 years you worked on this work, what were some of the thoughts that you had about the whole process itself and the people, a good number of whom have passed away?
Well, I felt sad. I felt sad because I knew this was a population that people did consider disposable. People rarely saw them as human beings, and they were being viewed in a way that was totally unhuman. And of course, we all live in a city where the homeless are everywhere.
Right.
And it's hard to see the humanity in people. And so I thought perhaps this was a book that might bring that to a different reality. And people could see people in a different way, and see people for the first time as human beings. And I thought maybe the book would help do that. But of course, I was writing other books at the same time, and all the books here that you see, I was also writing about the life of New Yorkers, and so this was just one of those attempts to tell the story of life in New York.
While you're at it, Terry, could you talk about this book and the other books and its relationship to Columbia University Press as part of the series? Could you tell us about that?
Well, I wrote a series of books, 5 books with Columbia University Press about life in New York. And each one sort of captures some part of the city that we don't hear a lot about. This book, of course, the same, around the same time, 2 years, 2022.
That's Late Boogie Woogie.
About life underground, of a different kind of underground life, but it's the life of New Yorkers in this small world called the Cocaine Club. At the same time, I was also writing about the sex lives of New Yorkers. And I found a lot of folk who decided to tell me about life on the ground, and I started to hang out with people who were having sex, different kinds of sex in the city, in this neighborhood, for example. And then I wrote a book about Harlem Supers, which I was trying to find something that would talk about gentrification and so I wrote that book. I wrote a book about India called Advancing Indian Upper Class, and trying to capture as much as I could about that world. I wrote about teenagers who were engaged in some kind of self-harm, and I followed these young men and women across the United States, and that was another one, and that was in the series. And then this final book here was a book I did about con games, because a lot of the people that I was interviewing underground, by the way, were involved in a lot of them involved in con games. And then to write about the world of ethnography, I wrote this volume with my colleague, Sarah Dane, about ethnography as well. And so that's some of them.
And when he said some of them, these are actually some of them, because we're going to open it up for questions, but I just want to say this. When he said some of them, when you go to his apartment, there are all these manuscripts in the apartment, like stuff he's working on right now. And it's almost hard to believe that he's constantly writing and working and thinking and dissecting the city and all of that. So it's been a pleasure for me just to know him. But at this time, we're gonna open up the program for questions. If you have questions, here's the mic. I can bring it to you. Just raise your hand. Here.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I have a small, short question. One of the things you mentioned earlier in the talk was that a lot of the residents, if that's the right term, of this underground community see this as a temporary status. So I was curious to know, was there like an average amount of time that you calculated that people spent until they transition out, and at what point do they mark their departure, or is there like a ceremony or a procedure by which you make that shift?
Yeah, that's a good question, but it's also difficult to answer because the 8 people who actually stayed around over the 20 years that I was writing this book, they spent 10, 12 years underground. And the underground also becomes somewhat addictive, because there's a certain freedom that you feel when you're living in that kind of space. Not only do you feel isolated, and there's a sense of neglect that exists, but you also feel as if you don't have anyone who controls you. You don't have anyone in authority over you. And so this sense of freedom is really, really exemplified by not going above ground for very long. And so I think most people who I talked to over those years felt as if it was better to live underground than to live above ground with all the problems, of course, what they call the chaos that exists above ground.
Thank you for this. I was interested more in the social dynamics of sort of like underground. Is this sort of, is part of the story sort of peaceful coexistence between these different groups and also within these different groups, especially thinking about the ones who lived for 10 to 12 years? I'm assuming there's some interactions between these people. Would you say that, yeah, within sort of these social hierarchies or these social dynamics, is it more cutthroat? Was it more peaceful coexistence? Did anything sort of surprise you about this world?
Well, this hierarchy of misery could be described as a hierarchy of misery. And I mentioned that people like Bernard considered to be at the high end of that hierarchy, selling books, selling cans, and that sort of thing. And at the low end, of course, were those who had some kind of mental issue. But I don't really get what your question was, other than that.
Sort of how sort sort of, how much did people coexist versus sort of have a very, let's say, like aggressive kind of posture towards each other? Was there a lot of sort of fighting, or was it more of sort of a community building sort of space?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, so I'm going to paraphrase, I think what I understand you to be
Can I
saying.
add something under that, because I have a similar question? Like you talked about a community fire where they cook. Was
Yes.
everyone welcome to that? I mean,
Yeah, well, let's,
that's kind of like piggybacks on.
But what the young lady,
I'll answer that too.
she's asking whether, if I understand it correctly, whether people kind of fought a lot or they got along, or was it both? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, just social dynamics generally.
Yeah, like what was going on? Like, is this like a family, so to speak? You know, where you have
Sure.
people in a family that may not talk for 10 years or what have you? There's no, or not at all, rich or poor? Is it like that?
Sure. If you can just imagine just for a moment, this particular space, this is a more than a mile long from 72nd Street to 125th Street. There are about 4 or 5 blocks that basically you cannot see your hand before you. You have this huge expanse. People are not connecting with each other just like you and I are sitting here. People don't see each other. So occasionally you might meet someone underground, and in that particular bunker that I told you about that a person has there, you have to go and find if that person is there. So you might walk several blocks before you actually see anybody. So this idea of community is kind of, it's an odd thing to talk about. But yeah, it did exist. When you ask about the fire spit, for example, the fire spit was where the Lord of the Tunnel would bring people to eat and to make food, make this sort of underground stew. And at that particular location, where they invited me to come in, I would go and take notes. Not physically take notes, but I would go there and watch people, listen to people as they told stories. That was the closest thing to a community underground that I saw and that I recorded. And but then there was also a moment when people would go above ground and have ways to connect with each other. And so this community was kind of an odd mixture and difficult to define as a community in that sense, because it was almost improvisational in terms of what they were doing and how they were doing it, except during the fire spit. The fire spit, of course, was a communal situation where people would sit and talk and eat and share stories. Yes, that was certainly a community. But for the most part, this was simply an isolated. It was an isolated world for the most part, even underground, and particularly underground. I hope that answers the question. Yes.
I'm coming to you.
Thank you. I'm curious what role the city of New York plays with these communities. Do they know they exist? Do they leave them alone? Do they ever try to provide service? Do they ever try to get them out of the tunnels?
Yes, in 1996, Cisneros, who was housing, who was the secretary at that point, brought housing vouchers. He heard about the population, they'd been written about it in the New York Times, and they brought housing vouchers to give to people underground so they could go and find housing. And so that was the closest that we knew about a connection between them and the family of people living underground. At the beginning of this story that I was trying to record, there were actually children there too. Once in a while, you would see families living underground, and that was really when the city wanted to do something about it. as long as it was black men for the most part, there was very little attention paid to the population there. Again, using this word population and community. But when that population, is, as it were, became connected to families, children, women, of course, more women, that's when, you know, you start to see the city get involved. But for the most part, they didn't really care.
Thank you.
So I read a book, I want to say it was the 90s. It dealt with a similar subject, you know, with people living underground central in the late 80s, 90s, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Old people, I think it was called. And to my recollection, the city did go in and like clear that out at one point.
They did.
Yeah, and like, I guess like, I'm curious, I didn't realize it had been floated and turned, or like, how, that scene from the photos I saw in that book, it was a very entrenched community. Like, the photos were, they were living there for a long time, and they all had homes and basements and lots of material goods. Did it ever get to that level again, or am I misunderstanding how big it got?
And what is the question?
Just how the continuity from then to now, has it returned to the heights that it seemed to have in those early 90s days, in those days of the 90s underground central? Because the area you're describing is different than that book focused on.
Well, Jennifer Toth wrote a book called The Mole People.
Yeah.
And she was one of the first people to actually record some of what was going on with people, with the population underground. But she was only there for a few months. And I thought it was important that in order to really tell the story of people living underground, you really had to follow them for a much longer period of time. I wanted to see at what point people would live and ask, and the question that you asked, at what point would they find a way to leave the underground, find a place to live, find a home. And I felt you could only do that if you did this over a long period of time, and that's basically what I did. To the point where the Lord of the Tunnel, for example, he found a house, an apartment above ground, and Cal, a few others found places above ground. They took the vouchers that they were asked. They took the vouchers and used the vouchers to find homes. So that was something that was very much a part of what I wanted to find out and wanted to follow.
One specific question about Bernard. It really interests me the fact that he was a guy, a bibliophile. You just said he found a place upside with vouchers. Before he went upside, did he have a place to keep books? Like, how did he manage?
Yes. No. He actually had a place in. It was called a bunker because during the 1940s and early 50s, they had construction workers had different spaces underground. They had a space for like a telephone operation. They had another space that was a latrine. They had another space. And so those spaces were still underground, a few of them. And that's where Bernard was living. And in that space, of course, was a place where you could have the books. Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you. I guess I have been thinking as you were talking, and I have not read it, I'm really sorry, about this notion of being inhuman. And people use different phrases for that. You know, like there are a bunch of phrases that people use for this. And I guess what's interesting to me is that in the past, I think it was easier to pretend you don't know about this, right? That it was invisible, and your work makes it visible, right? Like you can just be like, oh, whatever, you know, those are not real people. Do you see anybody responding by trying to do something? I'm also a college professor, so you know, trying to get me a degree these days. Sorry, you're all welcome. But like, what would you do? Like, if you talk to young people, what would you say to them about these people? Like, why they should care and what they should do about it?
Well, I think the most important thing is to is to see people as human somehow. I mean, every time you walk in the street, the first thing you do is to avoid walking close to them. You never say anything to them. You never approach anybody and say, who are you? How are you? Where are you living? How did you happen to be in this particular situation? Can I help you? We never see anyone do that. And why don't we do that? What is the reason why we don't want to say anything about other human beings who we see are in misery? Somehow we should avoid them. And this is not just one or two of us. This is the way the society views so many of our citizens in New York. And I've seen this situation in many parts of the world. And I don't think I've seen it quite as extensive as it is in New York. But the sense that we don't care about other human beings is something that permeates, that is part of who we are as human, as Americans, as you might say. We get to a point where we simply do see people as disposable. When we hear some of the conversations about the way homeless folk are treated, there's this sense that, why should I care? This idea that this is not my backyard, this is not my family, this is not anybody that I know, so therefore I'm not going to pay any mind to them. And this is the attitude that we have. And this is what I see existing. And this is, of course, part of what we see in the city all the time. Yeah.
We have time for one last question. Oh, here you are. Sorry.
When we look at New York City and think about the economics, when we look at New York City, the economy of New York City, we're thinking about formal economy. When we go, we have jobs, we pay taxes, and informal economy. I was wondering, how difficult was it for a homeless individual to look for a job? I understand that they collected Kenyan, so they did have connection to informal economy. But would you tell a little bit how difficult was it to try to actually get the job, to find the job, or to be hired in the formal sector of the economy in New York City? Thank you.
Well, as you know, we're writing about a woman named Tracy. I started writing about her about 2 years ago because she was actually living outside of my building in Graham Court in Harlem. And I would see her when I would walk and go home or whatever. And I thought, in fact, this is very similar to the issue that I'm dealing with. Why would I not talk to this person? Why wouldn't I get an opportunity to see if she could be a person who I need to know? So I started to interview her, and I gave her a little journal. I asked her if she would be willing to write about her experiences. And she started to do that. And I also noticed that in her writing, there was this erratic sentence structure. And when I approached her and I asked her to take a look at what she was doing, it turns out that she was suffering from some kind of psychosis. And when she would have this sort of breakdown, she would, in the writing, you would see that sort of, that irrational thoughts sort of played out. And so I went to a friend who was a psychologist, and I said, look, I have a person who I've met. And I'd really like to know more about her situation, who she is, where she comes from, and that became a piece that I happen to be writing now, and writing about her story. But I felt it was important not to simply see her every day in that state and not have some kind of connection to her. And of course, we're not going to do that with everybody we meet. But you only have to do it with one person. You only let one person change their life, just one. And I think if we were to do that, we would see a difference in the number of people who are having mental problems in the city. That's one of the major issues, by the way, is issues around folk who are mentally challenged, who need help. And of course, it's just something that we as a society should start to do more with. So thank you very much for talking to me today.